One of the sharpest skills in the colonial practice is learning to identify coloniality in action in the patterns, mechanisms, and behaviors that sustain everyday contexts, especially today when co-optation is everywhere. Even the language of decolonization itself is being absorbed, marketed, and repackaged. And in this atmosphere, the traps are sophisticated, seductive, and constant. From your experience, how can we train ourselves to sharpen our vision to recognize these patterns for what they are and to resist being captured by them?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very core question to our work at Possible Futures, and we all come to it from different ways in terms of like understanding why it's important to identify coloniality and why it's important to understand what powers it as well as what kinds of harms or symptoms that it causes. The most important way to train ourselves to be aware of and to start noticing coloniality is from understanding how coloniality works. A lot of people simply think that colonization is something where one country owns another country. Um, and so I think that is how colonial powers want us to understand it, because objectively on a piece of paper, like colonization no longer dominates the world, right? But the reality is, when you think about how westernized we are in the global south, where does that come from? If we were really, no longer in a colonial world order, would we all be speaking in this way? Would we all be consuming this kind of media? Would we all be working in this kind of economy that forces us to conform, etc.? We have a simplified understanding of colonization because that simplified understanding is what benefits our colonizers, not only now, but also in the future. So we need to really understand how colonization worked in the past to be able to understand how it's happening now. And I think without doing this kind of study, it's very, very difficult for you to actually be able to talk about it or identify different elements of it because you just don't have a good concept of what colonization really is, or the purpose of it, or how it generated profits and how it benefited certain types of people and not certain types of people, and how it harmed certain types of people and not certain types of people. So colonization, in effect, is about, a great divide and conquer strategy. That's really what it's about. So there's a divide part and there's a conquer part. And there's like all of these different mechanisms and effects that come out of those things. So I would really say that if we don't have a good understanding of how colonization happened in the past, especially if you are in a global south colonized context, then it can be very easy to essentially manipulate you into believing that your country is independent or that you have some semblance of sovereignty in your country, when that just might not be the case, whether it's structurally or culturally or in terms of like knowledge systems or what you're actually being taught in schools. If we're in a decolonial world, there is no reason why I would be speaking English. If we're in a decolonial world, there is no reason why I would be learning Western science in school or why I would have to, even go to work. There's just no reason. If we were truly decolonized, we would be back at our traditional or indigenous cultures, and we would be speaking those languages, and we would be upholding those value systems, which are incredibly different to what was imposed upon us from the European colonial project. Seeing things from an indigenous perspective of what was destroyed can help you understand like what is so bad about colonization and how did it have to work in order to do all of this stuff to destroy entire cultures over centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think it is a process, and it starts, as you said, in educating yourself, in understanding how coloniality happened in the past, how it's still ongoing, what are the mechanisms, the dynamics, gaining a more nuanced perspective about it, not just like, invading lands, taking material riches, things like that, but like how it manifests in terms of manipulation, in terms of like all the dimensions of it. And so I think it starts with this education and learning, but it can stop there also, like only this intellectualized um, approach to it. And something that we see a lot in our longer form course, Intro to Decolonial Sustainability, that we kind of follow people through months, and we kind of see the embodiment of decolonization happening or not happening sometimes, but how that process also requires, I think it's like peeling layers of the onion, right? You start by understanding, by learning, by researching, but then it's kind of like it reaches a point that to peel the next layer, it requires this self-interrogation, this kind of emotional meltdown of realizing the lies in your life, questioning your own choices, questioning your own relationships, questioning basically everything around you, and embodying. It's like, I think a lot of people also stop there because it's the difficult part of kind of connecting the systems around with how you are also complicit, with how like recognizing harms and trauma, and uh, changing yourself to be able to seek what we are talking about, systems of health and care and reconnection with what has been lost through colonization, through epistemicide, through ethnocide, and through this imposition of certain ways of living. So I do think that it is a lifelong process, as we normally talk about, because there's always another layer of this onion for you to pull out, and another process and cycle of ego death, of shedding, and changing these realities around you. So yeah, this is what I think is important, and embedding ourselves into contexts that we have people to kind of build relationality, right relationship, and accountability processes for ourselves to be able to actually grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's twofold. Like the first is that we are failed by our education system in the first place. So
Mm-hmm.
our education system doesn't want us to understand how colonized we are because, the education system is created and enforced by our governments, which are by definition colonial.
Mm-hmm.
Like no global South country got their independence and then went back to like traditional cultures and governance structures because it's a form of power. A national boundary is something that was like drawn as an imaginary line by the colonizers, and then they gave that mantle to elite that they handpicked. And so those elite are the ones who were most closely aligned with colonial powers during the colonial period, and they're the ones who were handed power of this like new nation that you now, go through the motions of celebrating the independence and then say like, oh, we are sovereign now, so we're free. When these are the colonial agents themselves who happen to look and sound more or less like you or other people in your country. And this itself is like, when you start thinking about the structures of coloniality and how you experienced your understanding of the world, how it was taught to you, etc., that's when you start to realize that you were lied to at every step of the way. You were betrayed at every step of the way. And I think this is what is hard for people to kind of like reckon with, especially to the point as you were mentioning, that you get to a certain page in the book where you just have to kind of like put the book down and realize that this book is about your life. And and that you are part of it. You are part of doing it to yourself. And then so there's a certain step of being like, well, I choose not to do this to myself. I choose not to do this to others, etc., before you can actually go forward. And I think that's really where the education starts, because up to that point, you're kind of fighting this indoctrination, basically, that you're constantly questioning, like, well, is this just a conspiracy theory, or, did this really happen? And is this really like a perspective that I should adopt? And then that basically continues to be a question until this point where you experience it as something that you can no longer look away from and can no longer deny. And I think this is like the single most important motivating factor when talking about, as you said, this lifetime of learning or unlearning in decolonial practice.
Mhm, mhm.